Good morning. Welcome to ISAP. We are pleased that zero deforestation in supply chain of imported agriculture commodities. I'm Chisa Umemiya, Senior Researcher at IGES. More than 250 people have registered for this event. We are grateful for your participation for next 1 hour. Let me invite our first speaker, Makino Yamanoshita. Makino is a Joint Program Director of Biodiversity and Forest Area of IGES. She is going to present why we at IGES wanted to organize this event at this time. Makino is going to speak in Japanese. Makino, you have the floor.
本日は私たちのテーマ別セッションにご参加くださりの
In this thematic track, a lot of people have registered with this thematic track, and we're actually surprised. And it's probably partially because of the COP26 that was just ended the other day. I'd like to share the screen to give you the background of this session. At COP26, unprecedented level of attention was paid to forests, and 140 countries have signed the Glasgow leaders' pledge to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. And the amount of $20 billion have been pledged by different organizations. And this pledge also mentions the trade practices that don't drive deforestation and land degradation. This will be covered by Samejima of IGES. And before Glasgow, it's not as if we didn't do anything. Before Glasgow, New York Declaration was adopted by the UN, and the world has been working on the conservation of forests. In order to realize the Glasgow Declaration, we have to base ourselves on the experiences and scientific findings of the New York Declaration. And today, the Secretariat of the New York Declaration, which is UNDP and assessment partners, central player, which is a climate focus, will give us presentations. But before we go into the presentations, I would like to share two background information. One is, why is it that we have to stop the forest loss by 2030? IPCC says before the end of this century, we have to suppress the temperature rise by 1.5 degrees, and they show the emission path. And net zero by 2050 needs to be achieved, unless otherwise we can't achieve the target of 1.5 degrees. And if you look at the net zero, the breakdown, those that are not reduced can be absorbed by forests. However, if you look at the current situation, these agriculture, forestry areas, together with fossil fuel industries, they are still emitting. Therefore, in order to turn forests into sink, we have to bring down the forest loss to zero by 2030. So this forest loss down to zero by 2030 is a very important milestone to achieve 1.5 degrees target. And also, we are seeing the heightened awareness on the part of the international community on forests. And so carbon offset, if 10 ton is absorbed by forest, and if credits are purchased by a company, the company can emit 10 tons without counting it. But they can just say that they have purchased it. But offset overall in the society, minus 10 plus 10. And this actually means there's no actual emission, effective emission taking place. So we are aiming for net zero society under the Paris Agreement. So the idea of offset should not be accepted any longer. So the companies' supply chains as well as value chains, we need to reduce fossil fuels in those chains, of course, and we also need to reduce emissions from forests inside the supply chain of the companies. This is already a common sense. And those companies that are trying to contribute to net zero is trying to start making investment to reduce forest loss outside of the supply chain, because they understand that nature is very important basis for their business. So whatever the business can be that can pressurize the nature, and that has to be changed towards the nature positive business. So we are seeing the rise of such a momentum. So COP26 has been the turning point, and conservation of forest is going to be accelerated in the future. Claire and Erin is going to talk about post-Glasgow era. We are already in that era. I do hope that this session will be useful for you to start thinking about forest conservation. So about questions to presentations, you can always submit those questions in the Q&A box. And we have started sending out information. We have a kind of like a blog called もっと知りたい世界の森林最前線, the forest forefront of the world, that we can learn more. So this is something that we can learn from if you are interested. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Makino. Our next two speakers are two specialists from the United Nations Development Programme and Climate Focus who knows the best about the New York Declaration on Forest and its recent assessment report. Claire Paz Rivera is a senior program manager and also an advisor with the New York Declaration on Forest Global Platform at UNDP. Erin D. Matson is a senior consultant at Climate Focus. She coordinates the annual New York Declaration on Forest Progress Assessment. Claire and Erin are going to present us on the New York Declaration on Forest in a post-Glasgow world. Claire and Erin, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Chisa, and good morning, everyone in Japan. Thank you so much to the IGES Secretariat to invite us to present in this very important event. I'm going to share my screen now. Please let me know if you can see the slides.
Yes, clearly.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. As Chisa and Makino have advanced, we're going to deliver a presentation on the lessons from the New York Declaration on Forest to inform this post-Glasgow world after COP26. My name is Claire Paz Rivera, and I'm going to be co-presenting this presentation with my colleague Erin. So, well, I'm going to start with a little bit of history here. The New York Declaration on Forest was launched at the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit in 2014 in advance of the climate meeting of COP21 in Paris. And it really had the purpose of promoting the inclusion of forests in the Paris Agreement. The New York Declaration on Forest is a voluntary political declaration that included 10 ambitious goals with the overarching goal of ending natural forest loss by 2030. Up to date, it has been endorsed by more than 200 endorsers from national governments, subnational governments, indigenous peoples and local communities organizations, companies, and non-governmental organizations. This year, in 2021, we conducted a refresh process, and the declaration text was updated to reflect the lessons from implementation to date, and also the fact that we have not met some of the intermediate targets that were referring the goals that were the 2020 targets. The 10 goals of the New York Declaration on Forest, as I said, provide for a holistic framework for forest action. Goal 1, the first goal, and this is, and I'm going to be explaining this is the new refreshed text of the declaration. Goal 1 aims to end the loss and degradation of natural forests by 2030. Goal 2 looks at supporting to reach the private sector goal of eliminating deforestation from the production of agricultural commodities well before 2030, recognizing that many companies have even more ambitious targets. Goal 3 looks at significantly reducing deforestation and degradation derived from infrastructure development and extractive industries well before 2030. Goal 4 aims to support alternatives to deforestation driven by activities such as subsistence farming and reliance on wood for energy in ways that reduce poverty and promote sustainable and equitable development that is inclusive of women, youth, and indigenous peoples and local communities. Goal 4 looks at increasing global restoration of degraded landscapes and forest land to restore and maintain 350 million hectares of landscapes and forest lands by 2030. Goal 6 looks at supporting implementation of actions to achieve forest targets within the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 7 looks at reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation as part of the implementation of the Paris Agreement in accordance with the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius in line with the Paris Agreement. Goal 8 looks at providing support for the development and implementation of strategies and activities to reduce forest emissions. Goal 9 looks at rewarding countries and jurisdictions that by taking action reduce emissions and conserve and enhance forests, particularly to public policies and scaling up payments for verified emission reductions and private sector sourcing of commodities. And last but not least, goal 10 is a cross-cutting, very important goal that looks at the strengthening forest governance, transparency, the rule of law, and empowering and recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, women, youth, and especially portraying the rights related to lands and resources. So these are the 10 goals of the New York Declaration on Forests. And as I mentioned before, one important characteristic of this declaration is that it's a multi-stakeholder framework. So we have 41 national governments that are signatories, including the government of Japan and many other important countries in the Asia-Pacific region. We have 21 subnational governments, 22 indigenous peoples and local communities organizations, 63 private companies, and 67 non-governmental organizations. As I mentioned before, this year we conducted a refresh process. The purpose of this was to reflect on the progress to date, considering that we already reached the intermediate milestone of 5 years after the declaration was launched, and we had not met the 2020 intermediate targets. So this refresh process look at and to integrate those lessons, but also to renew and increase the ambition and political will towards meeting these 10 goals. And also, while doing so, retain the framework of the declaration and the integrity of the declaration as a multi-stakeholder framework for forest action. The process was launched and conducted by a multi-stakeholder working group with representatives from each of the endorser group. And we also conducted some targeted consultations with the other partners and relevant initiatives that provided their perspectives and inputs to the refresh process. The outcome, as an outcome of this refresh process, we just in October, we launched and presented the refresh declaration text in an event that was carried out virtually because we're in the middle of the pandemic, but we had some very important contributions and reflection by our different endorser groups. And also we presented the revised structure of the New York Declaration entities, which are the global platform and the assessment. that from now onwards are going to be working in a much more coordinated manner, so that the assessment process that my colleague Erin is going to explain later informs in a much more targeted and strategic manner the activities of the global platform. As a brief summary of the changes, you can access the text of the previous declaration and the updated declaration in our website, but just to reflect briefly on the summary of the changes, we are emphasizing the importance of preserving intact forests by including a reference to degradation in Goal 1. We are promoting a systemic and multi-sectoral approach to ending deforestation by strengthening commitment towards the goal that towards goals that have not been met, especially in reference to Goal 2, that is related to deforestation from agricultural commodities and supply chains, and Goal 3 on mining and infrastructure, that are two goals where the intermediate targets were clearly not met. We're also strengthening the recognitions of rights of indigenous peoples and local communities by having a clearer and stronger languages under Goals 4 and 10. And lastly, we're focusing, we changed the language, focusing on implementation on the two goals that are considered that have been achieved. Those are Goal 6, that was related to the SDGs. In the previous text of the declaration, we said that we should include forest targets on the SDGs. This has already happened. The revised text of this goal focuses on implementing the SDGs, the forest elements of the SDGs, and the same on Goal 7 that is related to the Paris Agreement. So as I mentioned before, the two initiatives behind the declaration are the global platform. The global platform it has a secretariat with 4 partners, the United Nations Development Program, Meridian Institute, Climate Advisors, and Climate Focus. The platform was launched in 2017, and its main purpose is to engage with the endorser base and convene the stakeholders and provide collaboration at a practical and political level, share best practices and knowledges and resources, and support endorsers on meeting their NYDF commitments. And the NYDF Assessment partners are a network of leading think tanks and NGOs that since 2015 have been collectively assessing progress of the New York Declaration on Forests towards the 10 goals. And my colleague Erin is gonna present in detail these assessments, but they have provided very important recommendations to decision makers to move from commitment to actions and to advance on implementing this declaration. A very important aspect is that they remain functionally independent on the platform. So this assessment process is independent, but is coordinating now closely to make sure the findings of the assessment process inform the work of the platform and inform the work of the endorsers towards advancing on implementing NYDF. The secretariat is housed at Climate Focus. And this is my last slide. How do we see the relationship between the New York Declaration on Forest and the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use? Well, the two declarations are a bit different in nature. NYDF is a multi-stakeholder framework. As I said, we have active engagement by companies, indigenous peoples, and civil society. And so it's a multi-stakeholder process. And includes an independent assessment process, as I mentioned before. The Glasgow Declaration is mostly a government-led declaration that has been endorsed by more countries than NYDF. It really covers most of, like 90% of countries that 90% of Earth's forests cover, really. The countries that endorse the Glasgow Declaration cover most of the forest countries, and includes very important countries that are not part of NYDF, including Brazil, China, and Russia. However, we see that you know, the two declarations are complementary. They both share the overarching objective of ending deforestation by 2030. And this is, as Makino has explained, really critical to meet the Paris Agreement goals. So we see a real opportunity here to support the implementation of the Glasgow Leaders Declaration by integrating and providing the lessons from NYDF of all these years of really moving, of all the barriers that have been identified on moving from commitment to action, and the unmet and the difficulties of meeting the 2020 targets. We also have some very important lessons on enhancing accountability, the need to enhance accountability, not only at a global level, but also at an endorser level. And also lessons on translating the recommendations from the assessment findings to provide policy recommendations to move from commitment to action. And last, to expand collaboration for collective support to move the global forest goals. So we see there are some very important opportunities here to support implementation of both declarations and to work together towards this collective goal of ending deforestation by 2030. And with this, I finish my part, and I'm gonna hand over to my colleague, Erin Matson. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Clea. And thank you very much to the IGES team for inviting us to speak today. As Clea mentioned, I'm going to share some of the key findings from the NYDF assessment intending to give insight into where our global community is on ending deforestation by 2030, what our trajectory has been over the last 7 years or so, and where we need to go in order to meet the goal of the Glasgow Declaration. Overall, you will see that our community, our global community, is not on track to end deforestation by 2030. And for the most part, we're actually headed in the wrong direction now. So we need to significantly change our course in order to meet that target. So first, just a little bit more about the NYDF progress assessment. As Clea mentioned, we're an independent civil society-led accountability mechanism for the NYDF. The NYDF assessment partners are a group of research and civil society organizations, including IGES, who bring their collective knowledge and data together to provide global accountability for the goals of the declaration. And through our reports, which we have published since 2015, we provide constructive critique and evidence-based recommendations to meet the targets. Next slide, please. So as Clea mentioned, there are two sort of flagship or overarching goals of the NYDF. Goal 1 is to end natural forest loss by 2030. So this is in line with the Glasgow Leaders Declaration. The original NYDF Goal 1 included a target to cut deforestation in half by 2020. But however, as you can see from this graph, the 2020 target was not met. So the graph here shows 3 different data sets with 3 different definitions for deforestation. Despite their different methodologies, they all point to the same conclusion, that we're not on track to end deforestation by 2030. You can see the orange lines are from the Food and Agriculture Organization's 2020 Forest Resources Assessment Report. So the FAO shows that deforestation has declined somewhat since the year 2000, but not enough to meet the 2020 target. And the blue and green lines are from Global Forest Watch. They're both the high and low estimates of deforestation from Global Forest Watch, which is reported every year. And according to these data sets, deforestation has increased since the year 2000. And you can see a big spike in the year 2016. And in general, you can see that deforestation has remained about the same or higher as it was in 2014 when the NYDF was first endorsed. So despite the different trend lines that you can see in the data due to their different methodologies, you can see that together they do confirm that we're losing about 10 million hectares of forest every year. And so our 2020 target to cut deforestation in half was not met. But if we want to meet the 2030 target of ending deforestation, we'll have to cut the rate of deforestation by at least 1 million hectares every single year. And these data sets show a global picture. But if you also drill down into some of the more specific indicators of our assessment, you also see that some of them show that we are definitely moving further away from our targets, especially in critical ecosystems. So for example, in humid tropical primary forests, that's old growth rainforests in the tropics, those have been lost at a rate of 41% higher after the NYDF was launched compared to before. So we're definitely going in the wrong direction on goal 1. Next slide, please. The other flagship goal of the NYDF is to restore 150 million hectares of degraded land by 2020 and to restore 350 million hectares in total by 2030. The good news is that, as you all probably know, political will for restoration is high. Restoration has received a lot of attention. Tree planting, forest planting is one of the most popular climate change solutions right now. And we see that under the Bond Challenge, which was launched in 2011, endorsers of the Bond Challenge have pledged to restore over 170 million hectares of degraded forest land, which would have met the 2020 target. However, unfortunately, not nearly enough restoration occurred to meet the 2020 target. So we did a literature review tracking restoration of forest lands since the year 2000. And we found that only 18% of the 2020 target has been realized as increases in forest cover or tree cover. So approximately 26 or 27 million hectares of forest area was increased over those 20 years. But that's only 2 or 3 years worth of tree cover loss over the same period. So definitely not enough to offset deforestation. And much of that restoration also occurred in non-forest landscapes. So many countries have made big pledges to restore forest areas, but over the last couple of decades, they've seen that it's much harder to implement restoration projects than many of them had originally planned for. In terms of our work as the assessment, our ability to track restoration has so far been limited. There's not a lot of satellite or other data available to track restoration, but that's changing for the positive. New initiatives like the Global Restoration Observatory, TerraMatch, Restore, and the Land and Carbon Lab from World Resources Institute are working to improve and strengthen and combine their data sets on tracking restoration to help facilitate understanding and also to share best practices to achieve the restoration target. Next slide, please. And turning to the topic of today's session, so goal 2 of the NYDF is to end deforestation from the production of agricultural commodities. You may know commercial agriculture is by far the largest driver of deforestation. On average, it causes the loss of more than 5 million hectares of forests every year. Most of this loss in the last couple of decades has occurred in Southeast Asia, largely due to palm oil, and in Latin America, largely due to cattle and soy. You can see from the graph on the left that there was a peak again in deforestation in 2016. And since that peak, tree cover loss or deforestation from commodity agriculture has declined slightly, but it remains just as high as it was before 2014. So we did not meet the 2020 target of ending agricultural commodity-driven deforestation. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see a graph of commitments made by companies in agricultural commodity supply chains. So over the last 10 years or so, an increasing number of companies and as well as governments and civil society organizations have accelerated their efforts to reduce and end deforestation from commodity production. Initiatives like Supply Change and Forest 500, every year they assess how major companies in the agricultural supply chains who are exposed to forest risk are addressing that risk. According to their reports, more than half of the companies exposed to forest risk have made public commitments to address deforestation. But a large number of those companies still fail to report on progress in addressing deforestation in their supply chains. For example, of the 350 most influential companies in forest commodity supply chains, about 1/3 still fail to disclose any information about their progress in ending deforestation in their supply chains. For comparison, companies in the palm oil and pulp and paper sectors in Southeast Asia tend to be much more advanced in terms of making commitments and putting policies into place compared to cattle and soy supply chain companies in Latin America. So that is some progress. However, there are still many companies, including traders and exporters, that have not made any commitments to end deforestation in their supply chains, or they're very slow to make progress on implementing these commitments. One bright spot is that technologies are improving to enable forest monitoring and supply chain traceability. And these technologies are evolving rapidly and allow companies to improve their risk assessments, supply chain management, and producer engagement. However, it's still limited because oftentimes the tracking or engagement is only applied to a company's immediate supplier and doesn't reach all the way down the supply chain to producers, especially to smallholder farmers. And we've seen clearly that making commitments is not nearly effective in ending agricultural-driven deforestation. The challenges of ending agriculture-driven deforestation are much too complex for any one company to solve on its own, and the potential seems to lie in collaboration between companies, as well as collaboration with governments in order to design and implement holistic interventions. Next slide, please. And finally, I'll just share a little bit about finance. Of course, finance is critical, a critical piece of solving the deforestation problem. In our reports, we track green finance versus gray finance. So green finance is finance that is being invested in the protection and sustainable management of forests, whereas gray finance is being invested in ways that likely lead to deforestation. Our assessments have shown that gray finance from the public sector is 15 times larger than green finance. So that means that 15 times more money is being invested by governments in things like agricultural commodity production in high deforestation countries compared to finance intended for conserving and sustainably managing forests. For example, from 2010 to 2019, $135 billion was invested in agriculture and forestry in high deforestation countries, whereas financing for REDD+ activities in those countries was only $10 billion. So public finance for forests is at best only about 5% of what we estimate is needed to protect, restore, and sustainably manage forests in line with the Paris Agreement and the NYDF goals. And a quick word on private finance. Of course, private finance flows also has a huge impact. Trillions of dollars have been invested in commodity production, extractive industries, and infrastructure, and other activities that put forests at risk. But according to Forest 500, more than 86% of the top 150 financial institutions who invest in commodity supply chain companies have no deforestation policy in place. So they have no safeguards in place ensuring that those investments do not lead to deforestation. Many financial actors made pledges at COP26 in Glasgow to shift their investments away from forest risk investments. But one key gap is that disclosure and transparency in the finance sector is very limited. So we won't be able to track their progress unless they increase their transparency and reporting much more. Next slide, please. So overall, our findings from the NYDF make it clear that we'll need a significant change in direction across our global economy if we're going to reach the forest goals of the Glasgow Leaders Declaration and COP26 in order to meet the 2030 target to reach 1.5 degrees of warming, to limit us to 1.5 degrees of warming. So thank you very much. Thank you for your interest and for supporting action on this issue. And we're very glad to have been invited to this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire and Erin, for such a comprehensive presentation. Your presentation contained a lot of important message to us. We would like to come back to you later at the end of the Q&A session at the end of today's event. Thank you both. Before we invite our last speaker of today's session, I'd like to remind the audience that we are receiving questions from you. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to share your questions. You can type your question either in Japanese or English. Now, let me invite our next speaker, Hiromitsu Samejima. Hiromitsu is a research manager at the IGES Biodiversity and Forest area. He's going to explain us how Japan would look like in the context of imports of forest risk commodity. He is going to speak in Japanese. Hiromitsu, you have the floor.
ご紹介いただきありがとうございました。地球環境戦略研究機関の研究員。
Thank you very much. I'm Samejima from Institute for Global Environmental Strategies.
本日は日本による新リスクコモディティの輸入。
Today I'm going to talk about imports of forest risk commodities by Japan and impacts on global forests. The presentation material is in English, but I will speak in Japanese. As you already heard from the presentation, based on the researches, the commodities and farming of such agricultural produce is the biggest risk to the forest, especially in the Latin Americas and Southeast Asia. In South Africa, the cattle meat and soybeans and palm oil production in Southeast Asia. And many of these agricultural produce are exported to overseas market. Pendrill in 2019 estimated that 29 to 39% of deforestation in tropical countries are embedded in international trade of the commodities. For this reason, EU and Japan are trying to change the way we use the agricultural produce. And as introduced earlier, NYDF and also Glasgow's leaders' declaration on land use have been positioned as important milestones, not only on afforestation, but also through consumption. People are trying to promote sustainable development. And Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries of Japan targeted to achieve sustainability conscious import of raw materials by food industry by 2030 and a strategy for sustainable food systems. However, there's one thing that I'd like to mention here. The effective zero deforestation measures can be varied among the situations. We have 3 examples: country A1, country A2, and country A3. Deforestation is progressing in all these 3 countries. For example, if country B imports agricultural produce from country A1, and then the suppliers of A1 country and the import country B will have to work on this together, which means that country A1 may have some suppliers who have good sustainable management of agricultural produce. If that's the case, country B has to select such suppliers, and suppliers' behaviors must be changed. But in case of country A2, such country as Japan, as country B, only imports little amount of agricultural produce. If that's the case, then the producer countries will have to transfer technologies to country A2. Technical support is required. In case of country A3, other deforestation drivers are found. If that's the case, then we need to come up with other ways to mitigate the situation. So what can we do in these countries, and where do we have the priority? In order to understand that, we need to capture the current situation. So the question is, what agricultural commodities imported by Japan have potential to drive and reduce deforestation in overseas countries? And which commodities are leading to deforestation? As many have said, cattle meat, palm oil, soybean, tropical timber and timber products, natural rubber, and coffee. And I'd like to take a look at these commodities. And mainly I used the data from the statistics from FAO. First, cattle meat. So cattle meat, as you heard earlier, the companies are not really doing much to prevent deforestation when it comes to cattle meat production. And what's characteristic here is that only 10% of cattle meat produced is traded internationally. And deforestation coming from cattle meat in 1980s and 1990s was quite broad in Brazil, and it was accounting for about half of the deforestation globally. But since it was not exported overseas, it was not quite visible. And then currently, the cattle meat is exported, and half of that export goes to China. Now looking at Japan, most of the cattle meat imported in Japan come from the US or Australia. So Japan does not import cattle meat from a tropical region. So even if Japan makes changes, it will not really contribute to reducing the effect of deforestation coming from cattle meat. Next, palm oil. Indonesia and Malaysia had palm oil plantation, and this was leading to deforestation. And unlike cattle meat, more than half of palm oil is exported to overseas, for example, to India, China, and EU. It says EU 28, so it includes the UK. As you will hear, the intra-trade in EU region is not included in this calculation. So this is about international trade, which means that intra-trade in EU is not in this data. So export to Japan is about 3% of the production in Malaysia and 1% of production in Indonesia. Having said that, depending on the region, Sabah region is exporting 7% of palm oil, which means that Japan has higher impact.
Next is soybean. After cattle meat, Brazil and Argentina, they expanded their production since the 1990s, leading to deforestation. Just like palm oil, around half of what's being produced is exported overseas, and a lot of that goes to China. And Japan also imports from Brazil, but it's just 0.8%. Therefore, Japan changing its importing behavior will have quite a small impact. And soybean, mainly it's Argentina, but soybean oil and soybean cake, they are produced, and soybean cake is exported across the world as cattle feed, especially to EU. Soybean cake, Japan share is a little bit higher, so 3% of the entire export from Brazil goes to Japan. And the Japanese cattle industry is very much dependent on the soybean cake that's imported from Brazil. Now about tropical timber, and it's quite complex. And we have different colors. ITTO, International Tropical Timber Organization's data is used here, and it's not just a round log, but also sawn timber, veneer, and plywood. They are all converted to the amount of round log, and also other things like tips, wood chips, and pulp, and others. Those are not included in this data. Since the 1960s to 1980s, the half of the tropical timber was imported to Japan. Mainly they came from Malaysia and Indonesia. So this caused deforestation in a major way. As you can see at the top right graphs, including plywood, the imported timber amount has declined a lot. On the other hand, China, international trade, half of the tropical timber has been imported by China. Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands and African countries, China purchases round logs from those countries. And then rubber, after 15 years, there will be no rubber from the trees. So the trees are being used as woods, and 99% of the export from Thailand is to China. Gabon and other African countries, China also imports a lot from those countries as well. So compared to China and other countries, or compared to the past, Japan's presence has declined, but it's still importing tropical timber, and mostly they are plywood, and they are mostly from Malaysia. Salak and Kalimantan and Java of Indonesia. Malaysia and Indonesia. And if you look at the total in terms of round log, around 20% are being exported to Japan. And this is a natural rubber. Japan imports 1% of the internationally traded natural rubber, and mostly we import from Indonesia. And for Indonesia, 20% of their exports are for Japan. And in Thailand is actually the biggest exporter in the world of natural rubber, because in the southern part of Thailand, a lot of natural trees are being logged. And but from there, Japan imports only 7%. Finally, coffee beans. The biggest importer is EU, followed by the US, but Japan also has the same tendency, which means that we import a lot from Brazil and Vietnam. In Vietnam, the highland area in the middle of the country, they are expanding their coffee production, and that is leading to deforestation in Vietnam. And this is my conclusion. So as I have spoken about, compared to China and the EU, Japan is quite different in terms of the cattle, meat, and also palm oil. These are high forest risks, and we are not importer of those things. Looking at the data of the 30 years, we are not really increasing the import of those products. But as I have shown you, timbers from Indonesia and Vietnam, and also from Indonesia and Thailand, rubber, and also Brazil and Vietnam, coffee beans. Japan's shares are quite high for those products among these countries. Therefore, we need to work with responsible players to make contributions to the halting of the deforestation of these countries. We import soybean from Brazil, palm oil from Indonesia and Malaysia, but our import shares are very low. So in those countries, in order to have effective actions, as Japan, we have to work together with other importing countries and other stakeholders locally to work together. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hiromitsu, for your excellent, very interesting presentation. We are coming to the Q&A session. I'd like to ask all the speakers to come back to the main screen. So in the Q&A feature, as you can see, there are 4 questions. And because of the time limit, probably we won't be able to address all of them. But in this case, as Makino mentioned in the first, we'll take them in our social media and website later on after this event. Anyway, I'd like to ask each of the speakers 1 question so that you can respond the question very quickly. So first of all, to clear, this is a question written in Japanese, so let me translate. So question is quite simple. What are the benefits for a private company to become endorsed under the New York Declaration on Forest? And can you briefly explain that? And let me continue a question next to Erin. So the question is that a bit of challenging perhaps, but I'd like to give a try. So you have mentioned, in the assessment report, some aspects of critical situation. So question is, what do you think the innovative approach might be to address any deforestation, supply chain deforestation relationship, which is, as you mentioned, a very complex issue. So if you can share your idea, that would be great. And for finally, Samejima-san, there is a question about, you mentioned Japan's influence in terms of imports from the tropical area might be not as much as before, but question is here, importing itself may have influence. So what is your view on for Japan to address, a reliance on import in the issue of climate change? So I stop here and I ask each speaker perhaps to quickly answer in 1 minute. Thank you very much. So first, Claire, please.
Thank you so much. Right now, I will say that there's 3 main benefits of joining for private sector partners to join NYDF. First, they will be part of this global community of high ambition endorsers that share the common goal of ending deforestation, so they can have opportunities to collaborate and network with other endorsers. Second, they can receive information from the assessment reports that will help them advance on their commitment. And I think the third point is, and I think this is very important, as my colleague Erin has mentioned, we recognize that it's not possible for private sector alone to meet the challenge of ending deforestation from agricultural commodity driven deforestation. For that, they need to collaborate with governments. And as you have seen, we have several very important government endorsers in the declaration, and we are happy to facilitate collaboration specifically between government endorsers and private sector endorsers. And in addition to that, indigenous peoples and local communities organizations have expressed, and this is an activity we have planned for next year, an interest on collaborating directly with private sector partners to advance on specific initiatives in indigenous peoples' territories. So those will be three of the examples, and the declaration is open now. With the revised declaration, is open for endorsement, and we're happy to work with new companies in Japan and in the Asia Pacific region that will wish to endorse NYDF. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Erin, please.
Yes, thank you. And the answer to the question posed about innovative approaches, I think, is what Clea just said, collaboration, especially across sectors and across stakeholders. And I think one good example to look at is the Cocoa and Forest Initiative in West Africa. There's 36, I think, cocoa and chocolate companies who are working directly with the governments of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire to set up a new model for exchanging information, making sure that their activities and their priorities are aligned. And that initiative is still fairly new, but I think it's a good model that could apply to other sectors and other regions.
Thank you, Erin. So Hiromitsu, please.
Should I answer in English? Which language is better? So stopping trades might be better. That may be the gist of the question, but I don't think that's the case. For example, in the past, from Indonesia and Malaysia, from tropical countries, Japan had imported a large amount of tropical timber. But now there's no good tropical forest there, so Japan withdrew from such international trade. But long-term forest management and long-term trade management, that was Japan should have built such a system. And Japan withdrew from international trade from tropical countries now, but that does not mean that these countries have stopped deforestation. They have led to other areas, even though the trade tropical region has been lost. So even if Japan stops importing, that's not going to change the situation. So Japan should collaborate with the stakeholders in the international trade to make a conducive environment for forest recovery.
For those questions we couldn't answer, once again, we'll make sure to answer them on our web, social media, and inform you. Thank you to all the speakers, panelists, Thank you very much. And also, thank you to those who attended this event until the end of this session. We really hope to see you again. Thank you very much and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.